All right, everybody, welcome. What a great turnout for the first part of the year. Can you guys hear me? Okay, good. All right. I am so happy to be able to present Shawnlei Breeding. She is the Audubon EagleWatch Program Manager. I know many of you, or some of you, take part in the EagleWatch program, so it's going to be super interesting to learn all about it. Just a little bit of background on Shawnlei. She began her career as a nonprofit administrator before switching gears to pursue her dream of working with animals. She came to Audubon from Disney's Animal Kingdom, where she was a bird keeper at their Avian Research Center. She has a BS in zoology from the University of Oklahoma and an MS in conservation biology from the University of Central Florida. Her role as the EagleWatch Program Manager is a rewarding nexus of her wide-ranging work experiences and passion. In her spare time, she enjoys riding her Vespa, listening to live music, and spending time with her husband, Steve, and their two rescue cats, one of which may be on her lap right now, I'm not sure. But anyway, I'm so happy to present Shawnlei. So welcome, and I'm going to turn it over to Shawnlei.
All right, great. Thank you so much. Can everyone hear me okay? Let me know if it's not good. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak to you all. It's always fun to speak to birders because I know that you're an audience that loves birds as much as I do, and it's just always fun to talk with fellow bird nerds. So welcome to 2025. I'm so excited to talk about EagleWatch because that is something I'm very passionate about, and I'm sure some of you have seen bald eagles while you've been walking around or birding, even in the area where you live or other areas in the state of Florida. But as I talk about EagleWatch, I always like to start with just a basic introduction about bald eagles in case, maybe there's a few tidbits that some of you didn't know and might find interesting to learn. One of the things I learned when I came to this role as the EagleWatch Program Manager about 8 years ago is that bald eagles are only native to North America. I never really thought about their range before that, so I was really surprised to learn that they only live in North America. And we're very fortunate to have them here as our national bird, of course, our national symbol. Back in the 1800s, they were very prevalent across our country as, we were settling the country. We'll talk a little bit more about their population trends in a second. But bald eagles are such a large, beautiful bird, right? If you've seen one out in the wild, you know how majestic they are, how exciting it is. Even me, as I get to see them working at the Center for Birds of Prey in Maitland, I see them up close all the time. I'm still always awed when I see one out in the wild, and I still point and yell, bald eagle. So I'm sure you probably feel the same way. So here in Florida, our bald eagles are a little bit smaller than the bald eagles up north. So if you came from up north and moved down here for our lovely weather, you may have noticed our eagles are a little bit smaller. This is like a biological mechanism that helps animals retain body heat. So the larger you are, the less heat you lose. So when you move north where it's colder, those animals are usually a little bit larger. And then with bald eagles, as is true for all birds of prey like hawks, owls, vultures, etc., the females are the larger of the two. So if you see two bald eagles perched together, it's likely a mating pair because they're not really social birds. They don't tend to hang out together necessarily outside of the nesting season, unless maybe you see them at a communal roost or maybe at the landfill where you'll see a lot of bald eagles. But if you see that pair perched together, you will maybe notice that size discrepancy, and the female is going to be the larger of the two. And they're a pretty long-lived species. In the wild, of course, they have to deal with issues like car strikes and electrocutions and poisonings and things like that. The oldest known bald eagle in the wild was 37, and they know that because it was banded as a chick in the nest as part of a research study. And then unfortunately, 37 years later, was struck and killed by a car. And when they recovered the body and looked up the band, they realized that it was 37. Now, in a captive setting like zoos and other nature facilities like where I work, we have bald eagles that live with us as permanent residents that came to our clinic for treatment for various injuries and can't be released. Those eagles can live quite a long life. I think the oldest in captivity was 50. And obviously they don't have to worry about all the issues that you do in the wild. They get regular medical care and regular meals. It's kind of a cushy existence. So it's nice to see how long they can live. We're not sure how long they remain reproductively viable. That's not something we've really been able to track yet, But with most animals, they do tend to remain viable up until their later years. And they are one of the carnivores, as we know. They only eat meat, so any type of meat. They're not really picky, actually. We always think of them as those fabulous, eagles swooping down and catching the fish out of the water and eating fish. Of course, they do eat a lot of fish. That is a big part of their diet, but they also eat a lot of waterfowl, which is one of the reasons they nest here in Florida a little earlier than they do up north. Here in Florida, our eagles nest from October to May, and up north, the eagles nest a little bit later. Not right now, and up north it's snowy and cold. It's not really a great time to try to be fishing with the lakes covered in ice. So those eagles usually start nesting in the spring and go through the summer. But here in Florida, the winter is a lovely dry season, right? So the water levels draw down. It's easier to catch fish in the shallow water. We have all the waterfowl that come here for the winter and provide a very broad base of food source for their young that they're trying to raise. But one of the things they do that gets them into trouble sometimes is they will scavenge. So they will eat roadkill. You might see them on the side of the road along with vultures. And this is often, unfortunately, when we do get these car strike eagles. At the Center for Birds of Prey where I work, we have a clinic that takes in injured raptors. We get about 800 injured birds that come in each year, red-shouldered hawks, owls, all those things. About 80 of them are bald eagles, and a lot of them are car strikes, unfortunately. It's a very common occurrence. But what helps us with EagleWatch, one of the characteristics that helps with EagleWatch as we're going out to watch these nests, is that eagles do have very strong nest site fidelity. So they will always come back to that same nest territory, often to the same nest. They'll use that same nest year after year, refurbishing it. Each season, they might have one or two alternate nests in their territory that they might swap between. Those are usually going to be within half a mile or so of their main nest. They don't usually go too far outside of that area. They are extremely territorial, and they don't tolerate any other adults in their territory during the nesting season. So for that reason, they keep a pretty tight territory and usually come back to it year after year. And also, they are one of those species considered to be monogamous. And when you see monogamy in a species, it's usually driven by their reproductive strategy. So if you have a species like bald eagles where, they have these large territories they have to maintain, they have these big chicks they have to feed, and the threats that they face, it's very valuable to have a mate that can help you with all of those duties. And bald eagles do share all of their nesting duties. They work on the nest together. Obviously, the female lays the eggs, but once she lays the eggs, they take turns incubating. They take turns bringing food back to the nest, defending the nest, raising the young, and so on. So if you find a mate that's good at all of those things and you're successful, then you want to hold on to them. So as long as their mate is alive, they will usually come back to each other. If one of them passes away, unfortunately, or disappears and doesn't return for the next season, then they will take another mate, usually within a year or so after that. But here's a photo just to kind of show you some of those size differences. It's not always readily, available, or it's sometimes hard to tell if you just see one bald eagle perched somewhere whether it's a male or female. But here you can see the female is the larger of the two, and she's perched on the lower left. So again, she's the more dominant of the two, really. She does kind of rule the roost and wear the pants in the family. She has a lot to say about many things related to the nest and how they're building it and what it looks like and where he's putting the sticks that he's bringing in and whether she thinks it's a good enough stick. So it's always fun to watch them during the nesting season as they're working on their nest together. We have a lot of fabulous bald eagle nest cams here in Florida and then across the country, which are always fun to watch as the eagles are working on their nest together. It always makes me laugh. He'll bring a stick in. He tries to put it somewhere. She doesn't like it. She grabs it and moves it. And, they play tug of war. It's really cute. But they do build a ginormous nest. If you've seen one in person, they are really large. They are the largest nest of any North American species. It's, 10 to 12 feet wide, can be 10 to 12 feet deep. They add on to it each year, so it can get larger and larger. It's really like the size of a small car in a tree sometimes, or, unfortunately, because of the size, sometimes it can cause the tree to collapse, or it may collapse on itself. And the largest nest ever recorded was over in St. Petersburg, Florida, and it weighed 2 tons when it collapsed. I guess they gathered all the parts and weighed it. So they are quite a large nest, as you can see. And they do typically nest in those tall, thick, strong, old pines that we have here in Florida. That is one of the best substrates they have for security of the nest and height, which they really like. But they will nest in other types of trees. Down south, they use a lot of Australian pines because there aren't as many of those longleaf pines. They'll use cypress trees, occasionally other weird trees. They don't really nest in oaks very much because the canopy of an oak is so dense, and with that 6-foot wingspan, they really need a lot of room to be able to maneuver in and out and get to the nest, etc. So if you are looking for a bald eagle nest, you can usually check the tallest pines in the area with the canopy that sticks above, or maybe one of the pines on the edge of a stand of trees, because they do need that room to maneuver. They're not like a stealth Cooper's hawk or something that can swoop around and chase birds or get into those tight spaces. I just wanted to show you some of what the other nests look like in other areas of the country. We've had some interesting nest situations. The nest that you see there on the ground was kind of an unusual discovery. It was on an island off the coast of Virginia, one of those barrier islands. And I'm guessing they didn't have any trees on that island, and there aren't any ground predators, supposedly. So the eagles built that nest on the ground. I think it's one of the only times they've been documented nesting on the ground, and they successfully raised young in that nest. And if you head out west where they have mountains, a lot of the eagles nest on those cliffs there, which is more typical out west. And then in Arizona, they have eagles nesting in these giant cactus, which is crazy. It seems like it might be a little dangerous, but they're figuring out a way to make it work. They're so resilient. And here in Florida, the trend that we're seeing, which is really interesting, is that our bald eagles are nesting on man-made structures like cell towers and power line towers, and occasionally taking over osprey platforms. And this trend that we're seeing in Florida is a little higher than I've really seen in other states when I've talked to other biologists that track bald eagles in their states. So it's really interesting to look at when we look at our data each season, how many of our nests are on these structures and how they're doing. But let's get back to their nesting behaviors, just to give you an idea of the flow of what their nesting behaviors look like. The eagles usually come back in October or November, and the mates are coming back together and getting to know each other and working on the nest together. And then at some point, they'll eventually decide to lay their eggs. They can lay, 1 to 4 eggs. 2 is about the average. We sometimes have nests in Florida that fledge 3 chicks. But once they lay those eggs, the female or the male will be sitting on them constantly. The eggs do have to be kept at a very constant temperature for them to develop properly. So no one, one of the adults will always be on the nest once those eggs are laid. But what's interesting is the female lays the eggs like every day and a half. So she starts sitting, or they start sitting with the first egg, however. So that means that the first egg is about a day and a half ahead of the second egg and the third egg and so on as far as development. And it will hatch a day and a half earlier usually than the second or third egg. So you do get a size discrepancy with those chicks, with the first chick that hatches has a day and a half head start on the next one and so on. Sometimes you will see sibling rivalry in the nest where, the larger chick that hatched first might outcompete the other chicks. And you might see this on nest cams, for example. But in Florida, we have a pretty good food source, and the parents are really good about making sure the chicks each get a fair share of food. So we don't see that as often. Typically, we do have a number of nests that still have 2 chicks hatching, rather. In some areas up north, they might only see 1 chick typically in their nest. So those chicks grow really fast. As they're growing, you'll see them moving around the nest. And well, I forgot to mention the incubation period for bald eagles. It takes about 32 to 35 days for those eggs to start hatching. So they'll be incubating them and laying very low on the nest, covering the eggs with their body to keep them warm. It is a very tricky phase of nesting because they lay so low in that giant nest, and if you're watching it from the ground, it can be almost impossible to see the eagle in the nest sometimes, and it can look like nobody's home. But once those chicks start hatching, then you'll start seeing the flurry of activity. The chicks can't regulate their own body temperature for the first couple of weeks. So again, an adult will always be on them, brooding them and keeping them warm in these cooler temperatures or protecting them from the rain. And then once they are able to regulate their own body temperature, the adults won't sit on them as much, but may perch on the edge. And then, of course, as the chicks are growing, the adults will spend less time at the nest, bringing food in for them to feed, etc., letting the chicks learn to tear it themselves. And then eventually, as the chicks are getting larger and they're starting to practice flapping their wings, it takes them about 10 to 12 weeks to be ready to fly. I think the earliest documented is usually 8 weeks, but 10 to 12 is the average time frame from hatching to taking that first flight, which is always thrilling to see. I just wanted to show you kind of a quick graphic about what the eaglets look like as they're growing in the nest. When they very first hatch, they're white and fuzzy, super cute. The white downy feathers. You can see that on some of the cameras right now in Florida. Some of our chicks are hatching already. And then as they grow, they'll get this kind of dark gray fuzz. And then eventually their feathers start to grow out in the little shaft that they grow out in. They look kind of like a pine cone. They have a nice white mohawk on the top of their head by about 3 weeks. And that's usually when you start to see little bobbleheads above the edge of the nest. The first few weeks they're so small you can't really see them. But as they get larger, you'll start seeing the heads above the nest and the parents feeding them. And then they start getting larger and larger. They lose the white mohawk. Their feathers start to unfurl as they're growing out. And then finally by 10 to 12 weeks, they're fully feathered and they are ready to take their first flight. And this is what they look like when they leave the nest. So they are completely brown when they leave the nest. They are the same size as the adult at this point, but their eye is brown, their beak is brown, all their feathers are brown. They still have those bright yellow legs, but this is their very first plumage. Nature actually gives them slightly longer primary feathers that first year, and that helps them learn how to fly. And then each year over the next summer or so, they will molt their feathers and they'll slowly transition over 5 years into that adult plumage. So this is kind of the mid-range, 2.5 years old, the awkward teenage phase. And they're showing a lot of speckling, but also their eye is starting to lighten. And then their beak is also growing continuously. And so as it's growing, it's transitioning. The brown grows out and the yellow grows in. And then slowly their head, will get more of the white feathers. The tail will get more of the white feathers. And then by 5 years, they usually grow into their final adult plumage. And at that point, they're mature and ready to reproduce if they can find a mate in a territory and establish and build a nest together. So this is the image that we're all very familiar with here in Florida. We do have one of the largest populations of nesting bald eagles outside of Alaska. So we're very fortunate to be able to see eagles regularly if we're looking for them. Even, driving down the road here in Orlando in a very urban area, I can see them perching on cell towers or flying overhead, etc. So it's always so exciting to see them. But if you've been alive as long as I have, you remember a time perhaps when that wasn't always the case. Eagles were very prevalent again in the United States when settlers first came here and began settling the country. But as they were moving across and, draining wetlands and cutting down trees, and then it wasn't illegal to shoot bald eagles at the time, farmers were shooting them. They thought they were preying on their livestock. All these different issues were putting pressure on the population. And then unfortunately, in the, mid-1900s, a pesticide called DDT was introduced. And this pesticide was developed to kill mosquitoes, which is important because they carry a lot of human-borne illness. But unfortunately, no one knew or understood the impacts that pesticide would have on the ecosystem. And as it was running into the waterways, it was accumulating up the food chain to animals like the bald eagle at the top who eat fish and other things that live on the water. And it was causing issues with their viability of their eggs. So the eggs they were laying weren't hatching properly or weren't developing properly. And people started noticing that they weren't seeing as many brown juvenile eagles. They were really only seeing adults. And anytime you have a population that's not hatching any young, that population is slowly circling the drain. And that's exactly what was happening. By the 60s, people began to realize this was a crisis. And they began investigating, discovered the issues with DDT. And so then in the early 70s, the government put the bald eagle on our federal list of threatened and endangered species. It was illegal to shoot them. You couldn't cut down their nest tree. And they banned DDT as well as another mechanism for helping to protect the birds. And with these measures and many other conservation programs where they were bringing birds in from other areas that still had a number of them. They were captive rearing chicks and releasing them in other areas, all these different mechanisms together. The eagles made a massive comeback to the point by 2007, they were considered fully recovered at about 10,000 nesting pairs, and they were taken off that list of threatened and endangered species. So they're such a great conservation success story. And this is something I really cling to as, we sometimes see all the bad news about the environment around us these days. Just remembering that when we do take steps to protect something, we really can make a difference. And bald eagles are just the perfect example of that. Now, if you're looking here in Florida, like I said, we do have a large population of nesting bald eagles. Back in the 70s when they were listed, we had less than 80 nesting pairs, which was pretty low. So over the next few years, as they were recovering and finally delisted, we got up to 1,200 nesting pairs by the 2007 point. And then in 2017, Florida Fish and Wildlife stopped doing aerial surveys of the state and estimating the population. At that point, they put the population at about 1,400 nesting pairs. And that was really the last official estimate for a while. Now, probably, I think it was 2020, 2021 maybe, U.S. Fish and Wildlife was trying to get an estimate of the overall population. So they did surveys across the United States with aerial surveys of sections, and then they combined it with eBird data from eBird to see where people were seeing eagles and how many eagles were being seen. They did some statistical modeling, and they came up with some new population parameters that determined that bald eagles are in fact doing really well in the United States. But looking specifically at Florida, for whatever reason, they only surveyed Central and North Florida. They did not go into South Florida, but just with those two sections, they estimated our population to be around 2,500 nesting pairs. So that's great that eagles are doing really well. But of course, we want to make sure that continues and that they don't ever end up being in danger of going back on that list of threatened and endangered species. And so they do face a lot of pressures in our state, as you can imagine, if you've lived here very long. You've seen the drastic changes in our landscape as so many people are moving here, and we're bulldozing natural areas to build housing communities and roads and shopping areas and warehouses and all of those things. This loss of habitat is one of the main issues for bald eagles in our state. It's not only a loss of areas for nesting, but also loss of areas for foraging. And it's also pushing them into smaller territories as they don't have as many natural spaces for new nesting pairs to form and take up space. Back in the day, the average bald eagle nest territory was considered to be at least a mile in circumference around their nest. But now in Florida, we have bald eagles nesting about 0.3, 0.4 miles away from each other. So their territories have really shrunk, in our state at least, with eagles learning to nest closer together out of necessity, probably. But again, the other issues they face with these high rate of development in our state and so many people moving here and all of the roads, car strikes are a big issue for eagles in Florida, electrocution from all the electric power lines in the urban areas. Anytime you have a lot of people accumulated in one place, you get the toxins in the environment, like the issues we have with red tide from fertilizer runoff and so on. And then the unknown is going to be climate change, of course. We've seen how it has affected other bird species as far as shifting the time of year when they nest, shifting their range of nesting. Their range of nesting is moving northward. And these are things that we have to consider with bald eagles. They currently nest here in the winter because this is when waterfowl come down here. What if the timing of when they're nesting gets thrown off when the food source is available? And we also have a lot of eagles nesting along our coastline. Sea level rise is a concern for those areas. How will that impact eagles nesting along the coastline? So these are things we just keep an eye on and wonder, what might this look like for the future of eagles in Florida? And one of the other issues that we really are facing recently is some of the changes in the permits. So eagles are no longer on that list of threatened and endangered species, but they are still protected by state and federal laws. And the main law that protects bald eagles in our country is the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act. And that makes it illegal to cut down their nest tree at any time without a federal permit, although you can get a federal permit under certain circumstances to remove a nest. It also makes it illegal to disturb them while they're nesting. And back when I came to this role 8 years ago, you can get a permit for you can get a federal permit for disturbing an eagle nest if you're trying to build a house and the nest is close to your house. Back in the day, the permits usually were very strict about, not working 330 feet from the nest, for example. But now the permits are allowing people to do their work 30, 50, 70 feet from the nest while the eagles are using the nest. And they also introduced a new permit this last year called a general permit. Previously, when you applied for a permit for disturbance or nest removal, you had to fill out all the paperwork. The paperwork went to someone at U.S. Fish and Wildlife for review, and then, it got approved or denied. Now they have a general permit process whereby someone can go online, self-identify that they meet the criteria for the permit they're applying for, apply for it, and it's immediately issued without any review. So, this is concerning, of course, to make sure that people are upholding and doing the right thing, hopefully. The cost for the permits has gone down drastically. So it's making it much easier to get the permits, which does, also put pressure on eagles for some of the work that's going on near them. And just to review that federal eagle rule, the issue that we mostly deal with in Florida, thankfully, we don't have too many cases where people are illegally cutting down the nest tree, although it does happen. We do see issues with disturbance, and that's because of the rate of development or eagles moving into urban areas where we have, recreational activities, et cetera. So what the federal violation is if you do anything near an eagle nest that actually causes them to abandon the nest attempt, or if they were nesting already, if they abandon the chicks or the young or the eggs and the nest fails because of your activity. So whatever that activity might be, like, riding go-karts under the nest or flying a drone too close over the nest to try to get a look at it, or construction is usually the main one we have here in Florida. So the rule just says it's illegal to disturb them, but it doesn't really give you any details on how to avoid that. So U.S. Fish and Wildlife came out with some guidelines, which are just guidelines. These are not laws, but they said, in general, we have found that as long as you keep your work outside of 330 feet from an active nest, you're not likely to disturb them and incur a federal violation. So they have these buffers that are available as, guidelines for people to consider when they're looking at doing work near an active nest. But again, they are just guidelines. And the key thing to think about when I'm talking with my volunteers and they're worried about construction is not so much the distance of the work, but how the eagles respond. So, some eagles are very used to human activity and they will tolerate someone building a house 100 feet away. And in that case, the work is allowed. It's not illegal because the eagles themselves aren't disturbed. And so this comes down to, a lot of the nest monitoring that the volunteers do is watching how the eagles are responding to these issues. And that's really how EagleWatch got its start, actually. So EagleWatch started in 1992, back in the day when eagles were still on that list of threatened and endangered species. And U.S. Fish and Wildlife reached out to some staff at the Center for Birds of Prey and said, we have some permitted work that's going on that we're worried about near a nest, and asked if they could help monitor the nest and see how the eagles responded. So it started with a handful of volunteers watching a few nests in Central Florida. And this last season, we have grown dramatically over those 32 years, is it now? We have over 700 volunteers monitoring over 1,200 nests. So quite a lot of volunteers actively watching those nests, going out, throughout the nesting season, documenting what they're seeing. And it is really the power of community science. I'm just one person in an office in Orlando. I could not monitor 1,200 nests. And that's why it's so great to see how everyone can get involved in this project. Everyone can get involved in conservation through community science. The data that the volunteers are collecting and in their valuable spare time is so important to tracking the health of the population, because we are the only ongoing nest monitoring program in Florida right now. And both U.S. Fish and Wildlife and Florida Fish and Wildlife and other entities do rely on our data to understand how the population is doing. And we do work with a number of these groups as partners, because we have so many eagles nesting on communication and power structures. I do work closely with these companies that manage the structures. Obviously, they don't want to go up and do work on the structures while the eagles are nesting because that might disturb them. So they contact me throughout the season and ask, is the nest active? When can we start doing the work to maintain the structure? So you all have good cell service, of course. We need to find a balance here. So these partnerships are so important, and sharing the data that the volunteers collect is so valuable to them and so appreciated by them. So obviously the main thing that we're doing through EagleWatch is monitoring those nests and collecting the data. We want to know where the nests are located. Are the nests being used this season? Sometimes eagles take a year off or two. Sometimes they move their nest. And if they are using the nest, did they hatch any chicks? If they hatch chicks, how many survived a fledge? That's really the key statistic that we calculate, is how many fledglings per occupied nest. That tells us how many birds are being added to the population, right? If you hatch 1,000 chicks, but none of them survive to leave the nest, you basically end the season with a big fat zero. You're not adding any birds to the population, and that's not a good thing. So we do look every year at how many fledglings are produced in our population that we monitor. And we do also maintain the statewide nest map. Florida Fish and Wildlife created the map years ago and maintained it for a number of years. But their map was always about 3 years out of date because of the validation process they had to go through with updating it with new nests. EagleWatch, probably around 2015 or so said, we really need a more updated map for our monitoring purposes. So we used theirs as a basis and then kept a more updated version. FWC came along eventually around, 2020 or so and said, you're doing a great job maintaining the nest map. We really don't have the resources to do it anymore. And so they stopped maintaining their map. So they kind of turned that over to us now. So we have a form for reporting a new nest, one that's maybe never been documented. If you know about it, you can always report that to us. We can make sure it gets on the nest map. That's really the first step to protecting the nests, is knowing where those nests are. So, people that are doing construction or planning some work can always look at the map and see, is there a nest there? Potentially, should they, need to plan for that in their plans as they're looking at development, et cetera. So it's really important to know where the nests are. Now, this map is not all of the nests in the state. This is just the nests that were monitored by EagleWatch last season. And you can kind of see our monitoring does tend to be concentrated in those areas where a lot of our volunteers live, in these urban areas. Obviously, that's where people are out watching, but it is also where it's easy to watch nests. Now, we are limited to monitoring nests that can be viewed from a public area or with permission from a landowner. So you get up in the Panhandle area or some of those more rural areas where there's a lot of large pieces of private property. We can't get to the nests out there. We're not able to monitor those. So we really don't know how those eagles are doing. But the nests that we can monitor, we do our best to collect that data and use that as a subsample of what the population as a whole might be doing. Those different colors you see on the map reflect the different types of nest structures. So the bluish dots represent the eagles that are nesting in trees, and those reddish dots are eagles nesting on man-made structures. And of course, that does tend to be concentrated in the urban areas as well. A lot of the eagles using these structures are in urban areas. So looking at the statistic that I talked about that we do track each year for understanding how the population is doing, that's productivity is number of fledglings per occupied nest. So each nesting attempt where a pair came back and showed interest in actually using that nest, looking at how many fledglings were produced. And in my time in this role, the first number of years, it was usually above 1.3 fledglings. Then it kind of dipped down. 2022 was the year that we got hit hard by avian influenza. And that really decimated a number of our eagle nests. We had confirmed deaths of adults and chicks from avian influenza. So that was a hard year, but it has been slowly trickling up, but it is still below 1.3. So I'm, keeping an eye on that to see, is this a downward trend or just a temporary dip? You do see fluctuations in populations over the short term. So the long-term goal is really what we're looking at, but just want to make sure that, something else isn't going on. Within populations, there is also kind of an autocorrect where they reach a carrying capacity, where maybe they've reached the point where their population is large enough, but there's really not room for more growth. So we might see a leveling out. The other thing I look at is, of the chicks that hatch, how many survive to fledge? And that statistic is usually pretty high. It's above 90%, which is great. Again, 2022 was hard with avian influenza. It did dip down that year into 87. But we are, lucky to see that most of the eaglets that do hatch, that we document at least, do go on to fledge. But one of the other things that FWC would track, and that we track for them now, is brood size. So of a nest that successfully hatches and fledges chicks, how many chicks does it produce? And that number has been slowly going down. It used to be, above 1.6. Now it's hovering down, closer to 1.5, mid 1.5 range. FWC's goal was to always keep that brood size at least 1.5. So that's something we want to definitely keep an eye on. And that can also be a sign of that carrying capacity or the population leveling itself out. Over time, the pairs will just only fledge one chick instead of two. That's one of those mechanisms for slowing the population down if there's not room for growth. The other thing is, we talked about that our volunteers are out there doing, is identifying those threats and disturbances. As they're monitoring their nests, they're usually the first ones to notice if something is going on that maybe shouldn't be going on, or if something has happened at the nest. This picture you see was a few years ago. A volunteer showed up in October, went to go visit their nest for the first time, and found out that all the land that used to be woods was cleared right up to the nest tree. Unfortunately, these people did have a permit for that work, and that was allowed. But again, they are able to report that and make sure that the people have the proper permits and are following their permits. Florida Fish and Wildlife is the law enforcement for the eagles that protect, for the laws that protect eagles in our state. So you can always call Fish and Wildlife. They have a hotline, and let them know if you see something going on that is disturbing eagles, if you're worried that someone's getting ready to cut down a nest tree. It's illegal to cut it down at any time, even if they're not using it without a permit. So you can always call that number if you need to. And we do call that number frequently through EagleWatch. And some of the other things that the volunteers do is advocacy, educating people that they meet at the nest, you know, in public parks. Maybe people are walking around or looking at the nest, letting them know, here are some ways that we can be good stewards of the nest, not getting too close, not, you know, making sounds, trying to attract their attention, not playing eagle calls, which can stress the eagles out, to try and get them to look at us for a photo. Just some good basic EagleWatch etiquette as far as helping them to have a successful nesting season. You know, or a lot of these eagles are nesting in neighborhoods now, talking with neighbors about, you know, maybe they need to replace their roof. You know, you had all the hurricanes damage going on. Here are some ways that we can try to help, you know, let you get done what you need to get done, but also make sure the eagles are successful. And so they do a lot of that definitely on a day-to-day basis. Some of them go to speak at county commission meetings when they notice that the parcel the eagle nest is on has gone up for a proposed development. We've had situations where, you know, the volunteer went to the meeting to talk about the proposed development, and the developer did not mention the eagle's nest at all. And then the volunteer got up to say, you know, hey, what about the eagle's nest? And have had to send the developer back to the drawing board to reconfigure everything to make sure that the plans consider the eagle's nest. So all of these things together are so important for what they're doing out there, documenting the nest, monitoring them, protecting them, advocating for our eagles, and so on. So they're such a great, valuable resource. And just as a summary here again, just looking at some of the ways that we use our data, obviously we're using that data to track how the population's doing, sharing that with federal and state wildlife biologists. Our information is used to help inform permits at the federal level, making sure that we're aware of the nest, that the nests are where they say they are, and so on. Scheduling work for those companies, like cell tower companies that need to do maintenance on their structure, making sure that they schedule their work outside of when the nest is in use. And then also we get involved in rescues and releases, which is an interesting part of how EagleWatch kind of dovetails into the Audubon Center for Birds of Prey, where my office is. As I mentioned earlier, the Center for Birds of Prey does have that raptor trauma clinic that treats injured birds of prey. And a number of them are eagles. So often when volunteers are watching their nest, they may notice something is wrong at the nest. And it's usually with the young chicks during the spring season. You know, they're up and flapping and starting to practice learning to fly. And then it's stormy in the spring, and the young eagle blows out of the nest before he's ready to fly and ends up on the ground. We can assess and see, you know, does he just need a day or two to figure it out, or does he really need some help? He's out of the nest too early. It's not safe for him to be there on the ground. And we will get together a team of rescuers and go out and get that young eaglet if we need to. That picture in the top left of the couple in the kayak, this was a nest that was on a little island across a canal from a community in Brevard County. And the people that watched that nest in that neighborhood said the eaglet fell out of the nest and it was in some thick brush and it couldn't get back up to the nest. And so the volunteers went out and met with the owners and borrowed one of their kayaks and went across the canal and rescued the eaglet and brought it back. And then it was able to be treated and eventually released back into the wild once it was ready to fly. So there are so many bald eagles that get a second chance at life, you know, because of people that are monitoring the nest and looking out for bald eagles that they might see injured on the side of the road, et cetera. So we're always excited and rewarded to be able to see that we are able to make a difference in that way as well. So let's go quickly to go through some of the nest structure trends. I wanted to talk here at the very end about that trend of eagles nesting on man-made structures. About 20% of the nests that we monitor are on cell towers or power line towers now. You can quickly see here a map of where those nests are really located, kind of in that central corridor where we have a lot of urban areas. But looking at the data for eagles nesting on these man-made structures, the good news is they are as successful as eagles nesting in trees. Their productivity numbers are roughly the same usually. There was a dip again in 2022 with avian influenza, but this last season I noticed again that eagles on man-made structures did not do as well as eagles in trees. And it was the first time in a while I'd really seen that much of a discrepancy, so I began to wonder what was going on. So I also looked at the fledge rate statistics, so that was interesting. although productivity was lower, the number of fledglings per occupied nest, the fledge rate for eagles on cell towers and power line towers was actually higher. And what that tells us is that the point of failure for these eagles was in the very beginning of the nesting process. They started to nest, but maybe they didn't lay eggs, or they laid eggs and the eggs didn't hatch, or the chicks didn't fledge. Once they actually hatched the chicks, they fledged them successfully. So that was interesting to look at. And I began to wonder, what might be some of the causes for this? Is it not advancing? Let's see. There we go. One of the things I think might have played a part is this new process we're seeing where, cell towers companies may get a permit to remove the nest over the summer while they do maintenance on the structure. They'll clean it up, take the nest off, do their work. But in the fall, the eagles are really stubborn. They just come back and rebuild the nest on the tower, nest again, and the process repeats. But in the last year or so, what we've seen is that when the tower permits are done and they come to take the nest off the tower, they are also removing the platforms up there that the eagles used to nest on. And then the eagles don't have anywhere to rebuild when they come back. It's just a big open space and they can't get any sticks to stick. And so we had a number of nests in areas that eagles came back and weren't able to nest there. And so their nests kind of went dormant for that season. And in areas like Tampa and, Hillsborough County, where the majority of the nests are on cell towers, this is of great concern. And speaking with some people in the industry, what I've been told is that as they're upgrading to 5G equipment, the 5G equipment is a little bit heavier. And these towers actually have a very strict weight limit that they have to maintain. And in order to try and add heavier equipment but stay under the weight limit, they are looking for ways to reduce weight. And so taking those platforms off is probably one way of doing that. But it is unfortunate that isn't impacting our eagles, in this way. And, some of the side effects is that as eagles are losing their territories, these eagles in Tampa, for example, they don't really have many other options. There aren't that many trees there. And if they're trying to move into another territory, they have eagles all around them already. There's dangers of those territory fights, which can be quite brutal. And eagles die every year from territory fights. They are very serious. So these are some of the concerns for our eagles nesting in these urban areas. One of the ways that we are also looking at this trend of eagles nesting on man-made structures is looking at what the future might look like for this. If an eagle hatches in a cell tower nest, when it reaches maturity and gets ready to nest, is it drawn to nest on a cell tower itself because that's what it grew up in? So we've been doing this auxiliary banding study since 2017. It's an opportunistic study as young eagles come into the clinic in the spring for treatment. If they fell out of their nest before they're ready to fly, we give them a colored leg band before they're released. And the color of the band is based on whether they came from a natural nest, they get a green band. If they came from a man-made structure, they get a black band. And then we release them into wild, and with the hopes of eventually, when they settle down to breed in 5 years, maybe get in a resite and seeing what type of nest they chose. And so far, we have banded and released 122 fledglings as part of this study. We've had a number of resites of them within Florida and also on their first migrations up and down the Atlantic Flyway. Young eagles do migrate over the summer, go as far as up as Canada, come back down in the winter, roam around the state. We get all these really cool resightings and seeing what they're up to. But it did take, 5 years from 2017 for that first cohort to reach maturity and see where they were nesting. And we were so excited to get our first report of an auxiliary banded bird that was nesting. And she was a female that hatched and fell out of a nest on a golf course in South Orlando. She was released back by her family, and then years later, she was found tending to a tree nest in Tampa. So actually it was in Tarpon Springs along a big lake there in a city or a state park. So that was fun. When she hatched in a tree, she went to a tree. Then last year we had a female that fell out of a cell tower nest in Polk County in Winter Haven. She ended up nesting on a cell tower right in the heart of Winter Park near Orlando in Florida. And so she hatched in the cell tower, went to a cell tower. So it's only 2 data points, of course. You can't really draw any conclusions off those 2 data points, but it is interesting to see so far that they have been choosing the same thing for the 2 birds that we found. But if you ever see a banded eagle, please do let us know. Those colored leg bands are super easy to read, and I love getting those emails. So send me an email, look at your photos if you're taking pictures. Sometimes you may not realize the band until you go back and look at them closely. Something I'm super excited for here in the spring, just to close and talk about a new study we're starting. Just seeing how much the landscape has changed in Florida. I've really wanted to do another satellite tracking study with bald eagles. They used to do these a lot back in the day when eagles were on that list of threatened and endangered species to better understand how they were using their habitat, where they were nesting, etc. But since about 2008, 2010, they stopped all those studies. No one has done a tracking study with eagles in Florida in about 15 to 20 years. So I've been really curious to see how the eagles are doing. How are they responding to these changes in the landscape? This picture here is a very common occurrence. Eagles are nesting in an urban oasis, maybe even, and then the development moves in around them. This is just ongoing day after day with our state. And I'm curious to see if any of those findings from those studies 10, 15 years ago are different now. How are eagles moving among our landscape with the higher rate of development and more people living here, et cetera. So we were going to work with the Avian Research and Conservation Institute, which is up in Gainesville. They are experts at tagging different birds of prey and other species of birds, satellite tracking. The device is like a little backpack. It's lightweight. It doesn't interfere with the bird's natural behaviors. And then you can track where the bird's traveling. The satellite thing is sending signals, and you can see on a map where they're at, where they're going, how they're spending their time, and so on. So we're going to partner with them this spring. Our goal is to band 4 bald eagles that come through the clinic for treatment, hopefully 2 adults and 2 juveniles, just to get a nice mixture and see if there are any differences in their behavior. And we're really excited to start that. All of the parts are on order, and we're waiting for everything to come in and get ready to start that up probably March or April. So keep an eye out for those updates. We're super excited. If you want to be involved in that project, if you want to support it or sponsor it, you can always reach out to me. I'd be happy to tell you more about it. I'm really thankful for your time. I hope I'm not too far over. We'll leave some room for questions. I'm going to go ahead and put this slide up. It has my contact info. You can always reach me via email with any questions you might have. Let me know about a nest, concerns about a nest, etc. And you can also try to reach me by phone. I'm in the office a few days a week, working from home other days of the week. But again, thank you for your time. Let me know what questions you have. Hopefully some fun questions. I'll do my best to answer.
Thank you so much, Shawnlei. I am going to stop recording and we will take some questions, but we really appreciate it. And you've done some rescues out here, so we are happy to have you helping us assist some of these birds who have fallen out of their nests.
Right.
Anyway, thank you. I'm going to stop the recording and we'll go to questions.